who are you not leaving your draft without in 2024? That and more this week on the couch. Eric Moody. The double negative trips me up, but I know you know what I mean when I say, who are you not leaving your draft without this year?
You know what? It's so many players that I can end up talking about, Sig. But let's start with this one. This one may be fun. I'm going to go with Cooper Kupp to start off. Cooper Kupp. Now, here's why. One thing that's really fascinating with Cooper Kupp, if you look at ESPN's draft trends, like he's the wide receiver 21 right now. Now, I know he missed the first 4 weeks of 2023 due to a hamstring injury. He missed 13 games over the last 2 seasons. However, I'll look at Kupp. And I'm like, this is a guy that's averaged 9.2 targets and 17.4 fantasy points per game over that time frame. And just looking at last season, I'm like, he was held under 40 yards in 6 to 12 games. He did score 4 touchdowns from week 13 through week 17, which did salvage his fantasy value. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, right, Sig? Puka Nacua.
Mm-hmm.
His emergence negatively affected Kupp's target volume. But I look at Kupp, just to kind of close the loop on this. I'm like, he should be healthier this season. And what I found really interesting diving into the tape on Kupp from last year and also leveraging, some advanced metrics is that 87% of Kupp's targets last season came when he was open. That was the 6th highest rate of any wide receiver in the league. The rapport between Kupp and Stafford is undeniable. So I think Kupp should bounce back nicely in 2024. So he's actually one of the players that I have on a ton of my fantasy teams this year. I'll pass it over to you, my man.
Yeah. Kupp is fun because so Eric, what I am doing a lot at this time of year, like the dead zone in NFL news, is just I look at ADP and I look at it as a whole, and I especially like to compare it to the previous year, and I try to interpret, well, what's the question being asked of fantasy football players this year? And with Cooper Kupp, who was a consensus top 3 pick going into last year, right? Before he got hurt. Falling to the 3rd round. The 3rd round indicates a lot of skepticism, obviously, for the reasons you laid out, a lot of skepticism. So the question about Cooper Kupp is smoke coming out of the hood? Was 2023 a picture of a player that's starting to break down and get on the back 9 of his career? And in that case, then you're probably even staying away from him in the 3rd round, partially because, the thing is, as an aside, I'm going to get caught chasing a squirrel. For me, the 3rd round's for Derrick Henry. For me, it's like the 3rd round, that's Derrick Henry's round. I don't care what your league format is. I don't care what the roster size is. I don't care. Save your 3rd round pick. If it's in the first half of the 3rd round, you should hope. If I have anything to do with it, you won't be able to get Derrick Henry outside of the 2nd round.
Understood.
But fantasy football is sometimes, it's got its own intention, its own mind. But Cooper Kupp is another player, Eric, that the other side of that, the other side is if it's not smoke coming out of the hood, if it's like, no, just injury, cascade injury. Most players, when players get hurt in like July and August, just know they're not going to be 100% for the whole season. They're just not going to get back. You're as healthy as you're going to be when you show up to camp, and you basically deteriorate from there. And what we saw with Kupp is, he wasn't quite himself. You enter Puka Nacua, who's taking care of all this downfield stuff. And you have Kupp, who may not dominate to the tune of like 120 or 130 catches, but could be more efficient. When I zoom back from this, and the bottom line is like Kupp, 2-3 weeks into the season, Kupp is on a list of players that we could be saying that was idiotic that we were all letting him fall to the 3rd round. What were we thinking?
Yeah.
That it's not a long list of players. He's on that list. Those are fun players to draft. But when I step back from it, Eric, what I think is, are we sleeping on the Rams offense as a whole? Speaking of the 3rd round, that could be a Kyren Williams round too.
Yeah.
Because if you have a healthier Kupp and a DeMarcus Robinson, it's the run 3 wide as their base offense, and now they have a guy who seems to be pretty good in that role for them. You add Blake Corum. Now the running game has another reinforced, durability to function. Matthew Stafford, another player we're like wondering with his elbow last year. Is he declining? No. The answer is clearly no.
Not at all.
So this isn't, this is an offense we might be sleeping on. Another offense that you just delved into and gave a nice treatment is the Falcons. And I do think that when we enter our fantasy football prep period, and everyone go to the beach, that's what I'm going to do for a couple of weeks. Like, go on vacation, clear your mind before training camp starts. But and you got to have your angles. You got to have your angle of attack on your draft. And one of the biggest questions you have to answer are about offenses that have had big changes and whether you buy it or not. And the
Mhm.
biggest changes have been in Atlanta by far. I mean, this
Yes.
is an offense that could go from the bottom of the league to the top of the league in efficiency, but it's not that simple. What do you see, Eric, when you look at the Falcons offense?
Yeah, it's a lot to break down here. Maybe we can do it in chunks. I want to talk about Zach Robinson for a little bit. We'll kind of talk about that. Talk about Kirk Cousins, of course, and then we got to go into Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan. But let's start at the top and work our way down. So we've got offensive
Mhm.
coordinator Zach Robinson. We're talking about Matthew Stafford, right, Sig? Where
Mhm.
Robinson spent the past 3 seasons working with Stafford. I'm like Stafford averaged 267 passing yards and 17 and a half fantasy points per game over that time frame. Had success with Jared Goff. I think back in 2019, Goff averaged, I think it was like 290 passing yards and 16.4 fantasy points per game. But you look at his Falcons, this passing game, dreadful, right? They average 209.6 passing yards per game, run heavy system, Arthur Smith. We all know about that, but we also know about Zach Robinson's experience with Rams head coach Sean McVay. And I think that really suggests that the Falcons will have a more balanced offense like this season or strategy. And I'll kind of close the loop on this and I'll pass it back to
Mhm.
you before going to
Mhm.
these other players. But I'm like, you look at Los Angeles, right? They ranked 13th in pass and rush attempts per game last year, 7th in total yards, and ninth in points per game last season. And it really showcased Sean McVay's innovative offensive schemes. When I look at it from like a film perspective, like they lean heavily on outside zone concepts, motion, and bunch formations. And I find it hard to believe that Zach Robinson won't bring those elements to Atlanta. So what do you think about that offseason
Yeah.
addition with Robinson, my man?
Oh, geez. This is exciting, right? I mean, this
Yeah.
should be the stuff that gets your heart
Mhm.
pumping for fantasy football because you have just if all you knew about the Falcons is they were going from Desmond Ritter to Kirk Cousins,
Yeah.
you would have a lot of optimism just based on that alone. But I think that overall in fantasy football, and I love Eric that in I don't know last 5-7 years, I'm just pulling a number out of the air.
Oh yeah.
Over the time I've been doing this, more fantasy football players know who the play callers are
Yes.
and understand that those names we don't draft play callers, but yet we do. We do.
Hmm.
That's the thing. We are drafting play callers, and I think that when you look at what Atlanta has set up with Zach Robinson, and I want to give a shout out to Scott Barrett. He just did a
Hmm.
really cool thing over at Fantasy Points where
Hmm.
he went over the new play callers. Cecil and
Yeah.
I did a series, so just get to know the new play callers when there's a change. Because I mean, just think of it like you like to play your board games or your video games. Like that's the person that's a joystick. That's
Yeah.
the person, and that makes a big difference. That makes a big come on, you can think about like Mortal Kombat or something, where you give someone a better fighting character, but they're not as
Hmm.
good at the game. It might not matter. But with
Very true.
Atlanta, yeah, I mean, we are doing the right thing, Eric, by knowing these names, and I love that you brought him up and you said at the top. I mean, this is everything is downstream from this. Not even the quarterback; it's from the offensive coordinator.
Hmm.
But the key here is the Sean McVay, Kevin O'Connell nexus,
Hmm.
because Kirk Cousins was flourishing in Kevin O'Connell's
Oh
offense,
yes. Yes, he was.
which is Sean McVay offense. So there's no
Hmm.
transition. You look at Jalen Hurts, something I think people need to know about and watch. Marcus Mosier brought this up on my show.
Hmm.
Is the 95% of the offense is new per Jalen Hurts
Hmm.
for the Kellen Moore offense. He said, I've been spending off season 95% is new. Kirk Cousins, sorry, he's fluent in this already. So you have, of course, Zach Robinson, Kirk Cousins getting a lot more out of this offense, all these top 10 picks, than Arthur Smith and Desmond Ritter and Marcus Mariota and
Hmm.
one foot in the grave Matt Ryan were. The
Yeah.
question, Eric, is which one, who, where should we be investing in this revamped Falcons offense?
Yeah, I would say the first player that comes to mind, um, part of me, Sig, part of me, wants to say like Drake London. I got to talk about him and Pitts, but I'm really looking at Bijan Robinson. Like, here's why. Like, we had high expectations, right, for Bijan
Mm-hmm.
Robinson like last year. Going into fantasy drafts. Like, he finished the rookie season as what I think the RB9, but it's really like a
Mm-hmm.
mixed bag because we had like Tyler Algier over here. His involvement in the backfield was mind-numbingly frustrating week in and week out, and you got Robinson who only saw I think it was like 47.5% of the rushing attempts, but he excelled as a
Mm-hmm.
receiver. Like he ranked in the top 5 among running backs. You look at routes, you look at targets, yards, receiving touchdowns. But he only had 2 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line, which was painful. Huge missed opportunity there. But I look at Robinson as being obviously lethal as both a runner and a receiver. I'll kind of close the loop on it here.
Yeah, yeah.
But you've got, Kyron Williams. I know we talked about him briefly a moment ago. You look at his 2023 season, Sean McVay, Zach Robinson, right? 21.7 touches and 21.2 fantasy points per game. I think that gives us a glimpse of what we might see from Robinson this season, and I would say like in a Christian McCaffrey type of role. And you look at his average
Mhm.
draft position, that's got to be enticing, right? In the middle of the first round, come
Right,
on.
right. So I think we have basically three choices, and you brought up Drake London first,
Mm-hmm.
and the problem with Drake London is he's already being drafted in the early second round.
Exactly.
So for him, now look,
Mm-hmm.
let's make it clear: in the first and second round, you are drafting for a player to just return the value of the pick.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, where we I think make the biggest mistakes in the first and second round is when we think about, oh, this player can outproduce his draft slot. But if it's
Yeah.
a first and second round pick, it's more important that the player is going to come in, and that's our goal. We're swinging for singles and doubles. There
Mm-hmm.
aren't really home runs in the first round, but are there? Because Drake London to outproduce early second round, he would have to produce like Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase and those kind of guys, or Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Yeah.
That's a big ask.
Yeah.
That's a really big ask. And then there's Bijan Robinson. Now you might say, well, Bijan Robinson's going even higher than London. How can he? But you mentioned the name Christian McCaffrey. I mean, he
Mm-hmm.
can be this year's Christian McCaffrey.
He can, yes.
And it's as simple as like you mentioned Kyron Williams. And remember, Kyron Williams, there's skepticism because measurables wise, as a resume wise, he didn't look like on paper the kind of running back that becomes an excellent starter in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
But Bijan Robinson obviously did. And even though Bijan Robinson had a rocky season last year, like the rest of the Falcons offense,
Oh, yeah.
it's hard to watch. I mean, really, as a Steelers fan,
It
though, I can
was.
relate. As a Steelers fan, I can relate. Well, there is such a thing. Look, we're on the couch, Eric. Your emotional intelligence as a fan can help inform you as a fantasy football player. Because
Mm-hmm.
whether it was the Falcons offense or the Steelers offense, there are offenses that you watch and you feel the defeat before you even watch first and 10.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sense of defeat before they even start the game. And I think that internalizing that emotionally makes you understand like exactly what's going on. It was hard. It was a hard path for everybody in the Falcons offense, and obviously ended up
Mm-hmm.
with Arthur Smith getting fired.
Yeah.
That's what happens at the end of those kinds of stories.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll tell you this: another thing that stands out, Eric, is that Bijan Robinson did show why he was a top 10 pick at running back in the running back devalued era. He
Mm-hmm.
made some high skill plays.
Yes.
Not necessarily plays that blow you away from a physical trait standpoint, although if you look, it's there. Like the contact balance is there, the acceleration is there, the lateral agility is there. It's there with Bijan Robinson. But some of the skill and inspirational improvisation
Mm-hmm.
that he showed.
True.
I'm not talking about making someone like breaking their ankles. I just mean given this problem to solve on the field, how he went after it is like, wow, this guy is already a really, really polished, refined player and thinker at his position with very good tools.
Mm-hmm.
So in an offense that isn't a self-defeating mechanism and one that actually elevates its players, look at what it did for Kyron Williams.
Mm-hmm.
What could it do for Bijan Robinson? But what about Kyle Pitts? Because here's the third guy. Go ahead.
Yeah. Let's dive into Pitts. One other thing I'll add real quick, because there may be some naysayers out there, right, Sig, that are like, well, hey, this is Zach Robinson's first rodeo as an offensive coordinator. Yes, it is. But one thing about Raheem Morris, excuse me,
Yeah.
that I like that he did is that he built up a really great staff around Zach Robinson. A lot of experience, NFL, college playing experience, and coaching experience surrounding him. So I feel confident about him in year one. But let's talk about Kyle Pitts. It's another guy that's disappointed a lot of people. I think the biggest observation just over these last two seasons, outside of Pitts' excellent rookie year, is that I'm like the poor guy has been relegated to blocking duties. He didn't get many opportunities to use like his skill set as a receiver in mismatches against linebackers. Like this stat was really mind blowing to me, diving deeper into the Falcons and their players, is that I think he just ran about 20% of his total routes with a linebacker in coverage. And then 65% of his targets were uncatchable. That's obviously going to change with Kirk Cousins now in the mix. So I look at Pitts' production improving this year. And I like where he's going from like an average draft position or ADP standpoint. And I'm very comfortable having him as like my tight end one. But I think he's got upside for much more. So that's just some quick thoughts on Pitts.
Oh yeah, the upside's there, and there's a lot of
Mhm.
reason for optimism because he again play calling.
Yes.
I mean, here's where there wasn't a lot of argument about Kyle Pitts going into the draft.
Mhm.
There was almost nobody saying this guy shouldn't go in the top 10 or top 15. I mean, there's some of the people saying that about Brock Bowers, maybe because of Kyle Pitts,
Yeah.
but everybody agreed that he seemed like a difference maker in the NFL, that he projected to be a difference maker in the NFL. And that's why he was the highest drafted tight end. That's why he was the highest drafted non-quarterback in his
Yeah.
draft, which is in and of itself saying something.
Absolutely.
But I mean, that's like Marvin Harrison Jr. this year. He was considered that level of a prospect, and I don't feel like people have said yet, well, the entire football world was just wrong about him. Now, there can be elements that are non-football elements that end up explaining that, like Trent Richardson. I think a
Yeah.
lot of people a, give themselves a W on Trent Richardson, and they don't understand that the reasons he failed had nothing to do with what you saw on tape.
Mhm.
Anyway, putting that possibility aside for Kyle Pitts, um, it seems like a better play caller, a better offensive designer can take the considerable gifts he has, the matchup nightmare,
Mhm.
and do a lot more with it than Arthur Smith did. And then
Yes.
has a quarterback in Kirk Cousins who can unlock that. Last year, I think he wasn't 100%. I don't think he was 100%
No, you're right.
last year.
He wasn't. Yeah, he was dealing with a lot of just a lot of injuries, and that's something I read about quite a bit in the offseason. For where, to your point, we talk about these narratives. There's not always like a stat to convey everything, but he was one of those
Right.
guys that just from reading from what the coaches were saying and just some reports from ESPN's beat
Hmm.
writers and NFL Nation reporters. It's like he was banged up throughout the entire year, so we saw that on
Yeah.
the field as well. So you compare or you pair up, the lack of proper usage and physical ailments and health. It's just not a good situation, right?
Yeah, a lot of untapped potential,
Yeah.
which is what we like in fantasy drafts. And unlike Drake London, Kyle Pitts is going roughly the same, slightly earlier than he was last year.
Hmm.
Now, granted, we saw him fail last year,
Yeah.
and whatever way you want to ascribe the failures, reasons, point fingers, we put it on Kyle Pitts of fantasy football. We assign it all to like one player in their stats.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of skepticism. A lot of people are like, I'm not going there again. Because here's been the pattern for Kyle Pitts. Third round pick as a rookie, kind of sort of
Hmm.
close to produce that.
Yeah.
Didn't make you feel like you were wrong for taking him there, but made you feel like, oh, there's a little more there.
Hmm.
Third round pick, second year,
Correct.
indigestion. Sixth round pick, third year. So, okay, we're all taking a step back. Okay. Sixth round pick, still indigestion.
Mhm,
And I think if they hadn't gotten Kirk Cousins, he would have been a 10th round pick or 11th round pick or
mhm,
12th round pick this year. Instead, he levels back up in the sixth, sometimes in the fifth round.
mhm.
So skepticism, unlike Drake London, where the fantasy football community saying rocket ship to the moon, we're like,
Mhm.
Kyle Pitts. And I will say the one thing that gives me a little bit of pause about Kyle Pitts, and it goes back to why his rookie year wasn't better,
Mhm.
is I was all crazy for Kyle Pitts, even in redraft leagues, because I thought there's going to be a gap where the
Mhm.
league doesn't know how to handle him, and at least for the first 4 8 games, he's going to jump out and
Yeah.
really shock teams, shock defenses into counting for him. And instead, it was the opposite. They were ready, and what they were
Yeah.
doing, Eric, was putting one of their best cornerbacks
Mhm.
on him, and I think that he faces cornerbacks in coverage a lot, and he doesn't do well against cornerbacks.
No. Not at
Now,
all.
can Zach Robinson scheme him into more matchups with safeties and linebackers? Because
Yeah.
I do think that there is something. I hate to say this as somebody who was a really bullish person on Kyle Pitts as far as his fantasy future. I do think that you're seeing that. I can't remember who it was that posted a reel about him, that
Mhm.
they made some subtle changes where last year where they were giving him more like banana shaped routes
Mhm.
than routes with breaks. And it might well be that why cornerbacks give him so much trouble is that he doesn't break down. He can't like sink his hips and really change direction in a route in a way
Mhm.
to shake a cornerback. And hey, cornerbacks are getting more athletic and
Yeah.
faster.
Very
And
true.
I mean more. I mean they can win even against a guy at the catch point like Kyle Pitts. If you aren't shaking them, then it's hard to create things. So I I think the one potential point of we look back and say, well, even in now, Kyle Pitts was disappointing, is that defenses have figured out how to lessen his impact, and maybe Zach Robinson can't be the answer to that, but also could just be that, again, he's hurt. He's only 23, and I'm not going to talk anybody out of taking Kyle Pitts. Before we go forward, and the last thing I'll say about the Falcons, real quick,
Yeah,
and why it's easy to be confident in the Falcons. Offensive line. I mean, they have one of the best offensive. Here's what makes things easy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
For everybody. Here's what makes it easier to match up Kyle Pitts with a linebacker or a safety when you don't have to keep a tight end in the block, So absolutely, you like that. Real quick, I want to tell people it is the 4th of July week. We got a 4th of July sale, 10% off your first order of any Football Guys premium subscription. Fantasy season is right around the corner. Your elite plan is going to be redraft, dynasty, IDP, salary cap, best ball, custom rankings projections, start sit tools, waiver wire assistance, a little over $5 a month. So we try to be affordable. We over deliver at Football Guys, and we'll over deliver on the show because you've got a lot of players. I love it when we can distill stuff, Eric, down to just something actionable, And you gave us a good list recently of players like these are actionable. And one player got at the eyes. The eyes. Can I do it? Look, if you're on YouTube, you're missing it. You're not getting it unless you're on YouTube. The eyes were for Christian Watson.
Yes.
Why he get the eyes?
I got a lot to say about Christian Watson. I'm trying to be as brief as possible. So, one thing about the Packers, they are blessed with an abundance of talent at wide receiver. But I look at Watson. He's a guy I'm targeting in fantasy football drafts this summer. Let me explain. So, he's averaged 15 yards per reception over his first 2 seasons. Like only 13 receivers with at least 100 targets over that time frame have a higher yards per reception average. Let's isolate last year. Watson was second in points per reception. Finished 8th in end zone targets despite playing only 9 games. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. I just want to go ahead and address it now. Christian Watson's hamstrings. So there was a great article came out like in late May, I think on the 24th of May, I believe, from our NFL Nation reporter for the Packers, Rob Domofsky, where he discussed how Watson is planning on solving this issue. I just want to make a long story short. So you had Watson and cornerback Eric Stokes. They spent time this offseason at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. Now, they discovered that Watson had a 20% difference in muscle strength between his right and left legs. So the Packers used this info to build like a workout plan, to address this issue. And now, from what he said in that column, it's between 8% and 10%. And Watson, I look at him in ESPN leagues, if you play on our platform, for where he's like the wide receiver 40 right now. Now, he's a great wide receiver 4 or 5 to target in drafts, but I think the upside is much, much higher, especially catching passes from Jordan Love. So I really love Watson this year.
Yeah, he falls under that heading, Eric, of a couple weeks into the season, we might say, why did we let him fall so far?
Exactly.
And then he'll get hurt in week 5 and say, oh, that's why. No, I mean, in fantasy football, we're right and wrong in the same season, often, sometimes more than once. But you're right to point out that, and Eric Stokes is the other player that they sent to the University of Wisconsin. And maybe there's hope. I mean, we have to continue to evolve.
Yeah.
Injury stuff, Dr. Gene Bramall, I've learned, like most anything I say about injuries, I owe a tip of the cap to Dr. Gene Bramall.
Oh, yeah. Great
some
mind.
of the different, well, and he always understood exactly where fantasy football and medical knowledge and understanding intersect. We watched, even over the 20 or so years, 19 years I've been doing this, like ACL recoveries, or even people becoming more familiar, like, oh, an ACL plus is going to be different than an ACL, and how different injuries affect different players at different positions. And somebody's at the door, and it's Christian Watson that's going to deliver us championships in fantasy football if he can stay healthy. And now we have hope for quote unquote injury prone players, that maybe it is something physiological that can be determined and fixed. And with Eric Stokes, their cornerback, first round pick, who said, he ran in the, I want to say, low 4.3s, high 4.2s.
Yeah.
And he said it was a foot, I think it was a foot issue, but they tied it to, I believe, hamstrings. Don't quote me on that. Yeah. But he also said he felt faster than he did back then. So what an addition that could be to their secondary. And it would be something interesting to track too if the Packers franchise, their team, is rewarded for being science-based and inquisitive about helping their players
Hmm.
and helping the bottom line of their team. So I'm all about that. Christian Watson, he was coming on before he got hurt again
Yeah, I
last year.
know. So frustrating. You're right. I agree.
But there's the sign that it's not that he can't play, and it's not even that he can't do it with Jordan Love. It's that he just needs to stay on the field. And I worry a little bit, just a little bit, because it sure makes sense to me for him to be the player with the personnel they have to play like 60% of the time, right? I mean,
Hmm.
like load management. Load management is coming to the NFL, by the way, if it isn't already here.
Oh yeah, I
But I
can see
mean,
it.
fantasy football, uh, especially if we go to an 18 game season too, if we're going to have to become more familiar with this kind of stuff. But Christian Watson, because he makes such a splash on the plays he does get involved in, long touchdowns, big plays downfield, he doesn't need necessarily to be on the field more than 60% of the time with the
Yeah.
efficiency of this offense. But, Christian Watson, absolutely a player that could blow up. All right. I want to ask you something. It's
Okay.
kind of non-football, but we're not going on off the rails yet. We'll save
Hmm.
that. But it's kind of on the rails because
All
I
right.
see that you mentioned ESPN a couple of times,
Hmm.
the worldwide leader, you know, and you also list that you were a manager at a Fortune 100 financial services firm, company, outfit. I don't know.
Hmm.
So tell me how that experience informs your fantasy football and football analysis process.
Yeah, no, I can do that. Yeah, it's I guess the best place to start is that I've worked at like a lot of companies in the financial services industry. I was like a financial advisor before. So people would ask for like investment advice, retirement planning advice, and I would give it to them. So I've worked at Merrill Lynch, Chase. Before
Mhm.
transitioning to ESPN, I worked at USAA. I was an advisor, like in a call center type environment. Then I ended up getting into leadership, where I was train and coach others in that role. So I would say how that relates, like the fantasy, is for where whether you're positioning like a retirement strategy to someone or like an investment, whether it's like a mutual fund or a stock, you've got to put your pitch together and you've got to convince someone else. And it's not like a tangible item. You can't hold it, you can't
Mhm.
touch it. And so it's eerily similar to fantasy advice because, I'm telling you or trying to convince you to draft players from a certain team or a certain player. And I can't sit there and hold up Christian Watson. Here's Christian Watson. I'm like, you need to draft this guy. But I've got to
Right.
convince you with data and also with kind of a little bit of like emotion. So you kind of have to
Mhm.
play the piano with both hands for where you've got the data. I like to look at the data, but also like to look at what I'm seeing on film and kind of pair those two things together to give advice. So I would say to close a loop on that, probably the biggest thing that the financial services industry experience kind of taught me is that you've got to craft your pitch uh, together properly and make it concise enough to convince who you're pitching to get on the side of the table with you. I guess that's the best way to put it.
Yeah, yeah. No, no,
Mhm.
I like this too, and I like the
Mhm.
direction you went with it because I think a lot of an assumption might be like, well, this is about. I can't talk about fantasy football for more than a few minutes, Eric, without talking about it in terms of investing,
Yeah.
return on investment,
Hmm.
profiting, and so on. The perception is causing even we say undervalued and overvalued. These
Hmm.
are key terms in the fantasy football
Oh yeah.
lexicon that is looking at it from an investment perspective, but you're
Hmm.
talking more about what we're doing right now, and we're talking about this as financial analysts, no fantasy football analysts,
Hmm.
but more than that, we're making pitches, and I'd love that you appeal to emotion. I don't know how many times I've said on this show, emotion belongs in fantasy football. Emotion
No, it
absolutely belongs,
does. No,
and I get
absolutely.
it. I mean, go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, no, no. I'm just saying, like, absolutely. It's for where it's. And I'll go on a mini rant here. I'll try to keep it tight, but it's like you got like these two camps, right? You got people that are all about the analytics, all about the stats and the data. Then you got the people that are just solely on film with what they're seeing. They're fighting against each other on Twitter and social media or X, whatever you want to call it. And it's just going back and forth. My whole mindset is why not pair both of those things together, but also kind of look at like the narrative. And I know you're big on this from listening to
Yeah.
you for many years, for where it's like, what are the reporters out there saying? Like behind the scenes, what are the coaches saying? And that's the one thing that I've loved about being like at ESPN and also kind of writing that NFL Nation column like I did last year is for where I have a chance to at least interact with those NFL Nation reporters. So if it's something that
Hmm.
I'm wondering is like a fantasy football manager, I'm going to ask the questions. And then I kind of paired that with my own analysis. So all those things definitely belong. I just think you're a better analyst, a better writer, content creator if you try to combine all those things together instead of just planting your flag just on one and not being open to learning about the other things. So just, I'm done.
No, no, no. I mean, this is you're giving me the permission to do a rant that maybe I won't keep it short, maybe I will. But I think that emotion belongs in fantasy football and
Yeah.
fantasy football analysis. I mean, first and foremost, emotion belongs in fantasy football because it's therapy and it's play and it's harmless. I mean, I know some people do fantasy football with a lot of money on the line, but it's
Oh, yeah.
supposed to be harmless, and it's just a way for us to get out on our feelings. And so get out, take players because you like them, avoid players because you hate them.
Hmm.
It doesn't have to be purely analytical, even on that basic idea of emotion.
Yeah.
But you bring up numbers versus narrative or combining data and emotion. And I think that when I see, and don't get me wrong, I like there's a way of playing fantasy football where you stack 50. This is like investing again.
Hmm.
You stack 55-45 bets. You just stack them 55-45. You just make enough smart 55-45
Hmm.
bets and you will win in the long run. You will win more often than you would by just going with your divining rod of emotion and
Yeah.
feelings and vibes and stuff like that. But when you look at players strictly as an intersection of numbers and metrics, I feel
Hmm.
like you miss the spiritually uplifting part of doing this.
Yeah.
You just totally miss it. You don't get to participate in it at all. And I'm not trying to put it down as a way of approaching fantasy football because I think it works. I think it works better than my approach probably. I shouldn't have said that. But I'm not here necessarily to win as many leagues as I can. Although football guys, we're going to help you do that.
Absolutely.
I'm trying to win. Believe me, I'm trying to win. I do stuff where I shoot myself in the foot. It's not because I don't like winning. Is still at the high at that pyramid of needs, but the highest one is again that like letting go. And when you're watching, you mentioned it's like watching players. I like to say like you're getting to participate in greatness.
Hmm.
I mentioned those plays with Bijan Robinson.
Oh, yeah.
There's like 3 or 4 or 5 plays last year where you watch Bijan Robinson do something. And honestly, Eric, I don't want to be sacrilegious when I say this. Like the old player that immediately comes to mind is like LaDainian Tomlinson. The
Hmm.
last running back I remember from a skill plus improvisational
Yeah.
inspiration standpoint that Bijan Robinson looks like. And those moments are just transcendent. And it's a way fantasy football gives us a way to have just tiny, 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 tiny little part of that into our lives. And I think that is where that emotion, if you're not allowing that emotion affect your analysis, then you're missing that spiritual side of it. But then I also do, like I said, I think there's emotional intelligence as a football fan, like watching the Falcons offense last year made you want to puke,
Yeah. They did.
uh, that has some value too. But we can get back to emotion. I'll get back to some players that you
Hmm.
have emotion for in a positive way as people are starting to gear this up. I'll
Hmm.
I'll tell you what. This gives me an opportunity to bring up the Browns
Okay. Yeah.
offensive line
Hmm.
because I think that Jack Conklin said he'll be ready for camp. That's great. Jedrick Wills is coming back from a knee injury. Their number 3 tackle, DeJuan Jones, who was great last year, he's coming back from a knee injury. So we're very familiar with Deshaun Watson and
Hmm.
his disappointment as part of the story of what happened to the Browns offense. And also they lost Nick Chubb on the first week of the season.
Yeah.
um, a lot of obstacles to overcome, and they hired Ken Dorsey, and Deshaun Watson had his shoulder surgically repaired. We'll see, but the offensive line, I mean, take any offense in the league, Eric, and take away their top 3 offensive tackles by the end of the year,
Hmm.
and there's usually going to be big problems. So the Browns offense, I think, has more bounce back possibilities, not strictly through improvement by Watson.
Hmm.
And that in turn makes me even more interested as I hear you tell me why you're excited about Amari Cooper.
Yeah, it's like just to tie it back to what we were talking about before. It's like I'm an Alabama Crimson Tide fan, so I've watched Amari Cooper in college. Love watching him with the Dallas Cowboys. The Raiders. Now the Browns. All the teams he's been with, right? And he's a fun player to watch. Great route runner. But I look at his ADP, like in ESPN leagues. I believe he's like the wide receiver 31. which really surprises me. Now, I know he's entering his third season with the Browns. I'm like, he's averaged nearly 15 fantasy points per game over the last 2 seasons. And we all remember last year, right, where Cooper single handedly helped fantasy managers win their Week 16 matchup at that 50-plus point performance, like against the Texans, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm,
one thing with Cooper, I'm like, he's had 100 or more targets and 68 or more receptions in 5 consecutive seasons. Now, again, I always like to look at it from the other angle too, kind of put my sales hat on. A lot of people are thinking, but Moody, they added Jerry Judy this offseason. Yeah, they did. But when you look at it from a projections lens, I'm like, Cooper is still going to be their number one receiver. So he's going to get 100 or more targets this year. And you look at where he's being drafted. I'm very comfortable with Cooper as my wide receiver 3 or flex option. But as we
mhm.
saw last year, there's upside for much more. So he's one guy that I find myself targeting often in drafts.
Yeah, I think that he does have, and he's another one like Christian Watson. I'll add
Hmm.
George Pickens to this list too.
Oh, yeah.
It
That's another good one.
they're just wide receivers that I think if you're looking at them accurately, top 10 is within their range of outcomes,
Hmm.
without a doubt. The stars are lining up for that kind of ceiling for Amari Cooper. If Deshaun Watson is better, obviously, offensive line improved health could
Yeah.
help them have more time to throw downfield. I don't know what the Ken Dorsey offense is going to look like.
Mhm.
I mean, it's really the Kevin Stefanski offense
Yeah, true.
anyway. But Dorsey's there to help Watson. But Cooper has been a guy, and you mentioned Jerry Judy. And it's like, well, what has Jerry Judy done to make us think that he's going to have this gravitational pull of targets? We did this with Elijah Moore in this offense
Yeah.
last year, you know, and not that Moore didn't get the targets. Moore got the opportunity, but he didn't convert the opportunity. And meanwhile, there's Amari Cooper saying, "Yeah, I'm still getting it done." Now he wants more money, so
Hmm.
keep that. Amari Cooper. What's interesting about Cooper? You mentioned being a fan of his from way back when.
Hmm.
He's not that classic. What's my man Denny Carter, who I am getting lined up on the couch soon.
Hmm.
The wide receiver tweet is the enemy speaks kindly and carries a knife, right? Amari Cooper's like low profile,
Yeah, he is.
he's super low profile, but he feels like he's earned it. He had to endure the Cowboys disrespecting him. That's a long list of players, by the way.
Ooh.
The players at including many of their own players. Uh,
Yes.
so anyway, yeah, I think that Mari Cooper absolutely is an attractive pick where he is, and there's a lot of the Browns' offense. I think uh, we're underestimating in one way or another. Maybe Nick Chubb is another player we're underestimating, but
Yeah.
uh, another running back, a running back you might take around the same time that Nick
Hmm.
Chubb is going, and in the same part of drafts, and a player who's got some of that requisite buzz
Hmm.
so far. We're looking for that off-season drumbeat. There has been an off-season drumbeat around Chase Brown.
Yeah.
How important is it to get him? Is this guy you maybe even think about reaching 1 round early, 2 rounds early, get ahead of ADP because it's going to be going up?
Yeah, definitely. One other thing too, which I'd love to kind of bounce back to, is when we're talking about Amari Cooper.
Mm-hmm.
The two other similar guys that when you look at ADP, I would say is Terry McLaurin and also Diontae
Mm-hmm.
Johnson. So
Okay.
let's definitely touch on those guys. Let's talk about my guy Chase Brown, right? I'm like, he's someone that I kind of track my picks like in all of our ESPN fantasy staff like mock drafts we've been doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, Brown is one. I think I've ended up snagging him. I want to say it's a little bit over 40% of the mock
Wow.
drafts we've been doing. Now, here's why. It's like you got this guy heading into a second pro season. He's going to be the number 2 guy behind Zach Moss in the Bengals backfield. I think Moss is like the RB 31, while Brown is the RB 43. What I love about Brown from like a film perspective is that he has that ability to find like interior daylight as a runner. You look at him as a receiver; he really flashes a receiving target as a rookie. And one thing I thought was fascinating, Sig, like he's averaged
Mm-hmm.
14.4 yards per reception on screens alone. He uses his vision,
Yeah.
contact balance to win in space, and I just think he's a smart insurance play behind Moss. And I think his receiving usage really creates like flex value in deeper leagues. But how I'm targeting Brown, I'm really looking at him as like an RB4 or RB5. He's tied to a great offense in the Bengals, with Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins. I just think it's one of those scenarios as he gets more acclimated in the second season that he can end up leading that backfield in the second half of the season, kind of gives you that league winning type of potential. So that's really what I see in Chase Brown and why I'm
Yeah.
targeting him aggressively.
Yeah, you mentioned that 14.4 yards per catch on screens.
Hmm.
I think that might have happened. I know there was at least one play where he got a screen, and
Yeah.
he has great speed,
Hmm.
but you saw them get him the ball on a screen, and I think once he got past the effective blocks in front of him,
Hmm.
there was just nobody really
Yeah.
there with his speed that was going to have an angle on him. But that's good. That's a good thing. I'm not trying to take away credit to Chase Brown on that. What
Yeah.
I do think becomes more interesting, and I like that you are a pro Chase Brown guy without being anti Zach Moss. I didn't hear you say Zach Moss is overrated. He's going to overtake Zach Moss. He's going to
Yeah.
be the starter. It's Zach Moss can still do what Zach Moss does,
Yeah.
but
Exactly.
Chase Brown was doing that with Joe Burrow banged up for or not out there for a lot of the year.
Yeah, I would say, Sig, it's like when I look at like that backfield, we kind of win fantasy. It's like we always talk about people like planting their flag, right? And it's just like you like that you mentioned. It's not about, hey, Chase Brown is better than Zach Moss. Forget Zach Moss. I think it comes down to how you're building your team. Like I could see Zach Moss being like a target of someone if they're implementing like a zero RB or zero running
Mhm.
back strategy. Is like their RB2 or something like that. But what I always like to look for, I like to look for guys that can be like home runs. So I'm just really like attracted to Browns like ADP and RB43. But if I'm building a team a certain way, I'd be happy to take Zach Moss as well. Both of those guys are going to get run in this offense. So I just wanted to
Yeah.
kind of elaborate on that because I'm glad that you mentioned
Oh
that.
yeah.
It's not an either or, right? You know?
Yeah. Yeah, well, in the Bengals offense, I
Hmm.
think if you believe that Joe Burrow's wrist is gonna be okay,
Yeah.
which isn't 100% automatic, why would you even doubt that? Or
Hmm.
otherwise, that Joe Burrow's physiology, again, talking about injuries and physiology,
Yeah.
that he is a player that can hold up in the NFL at the quarterback position. But you talk about the possibility for Chase Brown being a home run. He's a home run if Burrow stays healthy. I wanted the Steelers to take Amari Smith, Steelers fan here,
Hmm.
but it sounds like he might already be ready to be the right tackle. They signed Trent Brown. Is Trent Brown going to hold up? Well, he might be the swing tackle. That's a pretty
Hmm.
good swing tackle.
Hmm.
That gives
Yeah.
me.
Agreed.
We talked about injuries to the tackles for the Cleveland offensive line, and that preserves Trent Brown too. That's been the main issue with Trent Brown is just staying on the field. So all these things are very good things for the Bengals offense. And then just like you said, both Moss and Brown can hit. At that point, if it's a good offense and you have a split backfield, both running backs can be hits at ADP. But Brown is the one that can really be the home run, partially because, well, hey, Zach Moss isn't known for staying healthy, although he did
Yeah.
for the
Good
most
point.
part last year. But then there's that speed. And I want to go back to that screen pass that just there was nobody in front of him.
Hmm.
It makes me think of Miami and Devin Achan, where when you have Joe Burrow and you have T. Higgins and you have Jamar Chase and you have Jermaine Burton, um, then you're going to create space in defenses because that's going to be their number one. That was what happened when the Bengals offense sputtered. It was because Burrow couldn't throw downfield, everything
Yeah.
got compressed, and they were just easy to defend. But if they're difficult to defend, then now Chase Brown's speed can really come into play. And then if you have him via injury getting the lead back
Yeah.
role, which it sounds like they're excited about him. Everything they're saying is that they're excited about him. You should be excited about him. Okay, before we go off the rails, you mentioned Terry McLaurin, you mentioned
Hmm.
Diontae Johnson. So Terry McLaurin, another one, going around the same part of the draft as
Yeah.
Amari Cooper. New quarterback, new offensive coordinator,
Mhm.
new fantasy ceiling.
Yeah, and I'll be brief on McLaurin. It's I think probably the bigger thing for me is like, I look at him, I see another number one receiver. I'm like he's being underrated from like a ADP perspective. Wide receiver 33, like in ESPN leagues, like he's cleared 1,000 yards in 4 consecutive seasons. He's averaged like 8 targets, 13 fantasy points per game over that time frame. I think that's impressive, like considering Washington's quarterback woes so far during his career. So you've got Jaden Daniels under center. So I think McLaurin can really prosper. Again, he's a guy that you can get as like your, depending on how the draft is going, right? Like a wide receiver 3 or flex
Mhm.
or a wide receiver 4. And so I just find myself gravitating towards taking him like early, like and often in drafts. So that's all I would have to say
Yeah.
about McLaurin. But I'm excited to talk about my guy Diontae Johnson.
Okay. Well, maybe it's my Steelers fan, hard feelings that I'm
Yeah.
saving him for last. I'll just add this. I'll tack this on to the
Oh
McLaurin
no, you're
picture.
good. Go ahead, my man.
He's the kind of player like DJ Moore
Mhm.
going into last year. We felt like
Yes.
his numbers have never matched his talent. We've always watched him say he's really good at football, And for any number of reasons, his numbers have never really matched what we see. Let's talk about watching emotion. He's a really good receiver. And Jaden Daniels, what he did last year at LSU and what hopefully Cliff Kingsbury will allow him to do this year is throw downfield, take shots downfield.
Yeah.
And yet that could really light the fuse for Terry McLaurin. Okay, Diontae Johnson. Um, and we got Bryce Young, maybe with Dave Canales making things better.
Yeah.
The Panthers franchise,
Mhm.
like a sinking ship. Diontae Johnson was a sinking ship in fantasy football last year. Is he going to keep you afloat or do even better this year?
Yeah, I just see him doing better because it's again, I'm in the draft and I see guys like Terry McLaurin, Amari Cooper, Diontae Johnson's another guy, wide receiver 38 in ESPN's live draft trends, and he's another guy that's probably one of my most drafted players in the in our mock drafts where we're tracking like who we're picking. You brought up some good points. You got the new coaching regime that's there. We expect a second year leap with Bryce Young, and I just think this in general, and I'll kind of go high level and kind of bring it back down to
Mhm.
Johnson is that I think we got a bad habit like in fantasy for where we're constantly looking through the rearview mirror. Nobody drives their car, right, Sig, by
Right.
looking in the rearview mirror. They're looking straight ahead, and they use the
Mhm.
rearview mirror occasionally. So you got to think about how players progress. And everyone may be like, "Oh, Bryce Young was trash as a rookie,"
Right, right,
that
right.
kind of mentality. But here's the deal: like you got a guy who's going to have his first full NFL offseason in Carolina with those players. And that's a big jump from going to college, to the pros. So that's going to help. New coaching regime. But I look at Johnson. I'm like, he averaged 8.3 targets per game in his career. You and I both know it hasn't always translated to fantasy points. Like over the last 2 seasons, it's just been like 11 fantasy points per game. But he has minimal competition for targets in Carolina. They brought him there to be the number one guy. So I do expect the offense to improve under Canales. And you think back, he revived Geno Smith's career, Baker Mayfield's
Yep.
career, and I'm looking at another guy that's wide receiver 38 in ESPN leagues that is a guy who will see like 100 or more targets in that offense, and you really can't find many guys like that at that stage of the draft. So
Right.
that's really what's attractive to me with Johnson. So
Yeah, the only risk with Johnson really is,
yeah,
well, injuries, and he's
true.
not a guy who goes down with catastrophic injuries.
Hmm.
There's just multiple times a year you'll see
Yeah.
him like, oh, Deontay Johnson's not out there. He's on the sidelines or looking at his leg. What's going on?
Hmm.
He does have a little bit less tolerance for those kinds of things as far as gritting his teeth and playing through
Yeah.
minor things or even like missing plays during games that just make you feel a little less confident about starting him the next week when he's questionable. Um, but or alienate, getting on bad terms with the team. I mean, that's again like nebulous. I don't know how we can really quantify that.
Yeah.
But what you are going to see from him is to Dave Canales, like you mentioned. I mean, we know he's a rational actor. He's not going to be Matt Canada. He's not going to be,
Yeah.
he's not going to be a Nathaniel Hackett.
Hmm.
And he's going to make things easy on Bryce Young. They brought in a couple of really good interior offensive linemen.
Yeah, they did.
I suppose the theory is they're like stabilize a short quarterback needs to be able to see guard and tackle or more. I mean, guard and center are more important. And then throw to the guy who's open. That's always Diontae Johnson.
Hmm.
That's all. 120, 130 catches, absolutely in his range of outcomes. So again, the theme here is like you're leading us, Eric, to all these wide receivers who have a chance to really crush their ADP.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's foreseeable. It's foreseeable. Another thing that's foreseeable, and I know for people who have dogs, I know maybe some people who have served and have PTSD. I mentioned light the fuse. It's on our mind as we go off the rails. It's first like fireworks. What's more American than fireworks on the 4th of July? What's your stance? When I say fireworks, what's your stance? What are your experiences? What's your feelings about 4th of July fireworks?
No, I love Fourth of July fireworks. I just got so many memories growing up. You're sitting out there at night. You got like your food, you got hamburgers, hot dogs, chips, French fries, and you got all this dessert, and you're out there watching fireworks. Or, since I grew up in Alabama, so we would just do our own fireworks like out
Yes.
in our yard. So that where I'm at now, because I'm in the Dallas, Texas area. You got HOAs and all that kind of stuff where they'll put the clamp down on you if you try to do anything like that. But that's how I remember growing up. And so when I
Yeah.
think of 4th of July, I think about food. I think about fireworks, and I think about really appreciation for our country, our
Hmm.
history. So as a father now, of two kids, like try to weave all those things together. Obviously have fun, fireworks, food, but also kind of weave the history into it as well, because I think that's important.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
This is a fantasy football show, so I won't. There's a lot of things I could say about
I know.
America and American history right
Yeah.
now. But to go back to the specific topic, but I think you're right. I mean, I
Mhm.
think we should all reflect on America and whatever it means to us,
Yeah.
and as Americans, and boy, we're here on a fantasy football show. We have this whole thing devoted to having pretend teams of football players. That's American.
Mhm.
But you mentioned the fireworks growing up. Now, were fireworks legal where you grew up in Alabama?
Yeah, yeah, they were. Like I would grow up remembering all the different fireworks stands,
Yeah.
little kind of like food truck kind of cart type things
Mhm.
where you could just go up
Mhm.
there and you buy whatever you would want, and you just kind of go in the backyard, because they had a decent sized backyard, and you would just shoot your
Uh-huh.
fireworks, and you just look up in the sky and you'll see all these other houses like around you where people are doing
Yes.
fireworks and the noise. But
Yeah.
it's you don't find that too often anymore, at least where the part of the country where I live. So
Yeah. Well, it is definitely still going on here in New Orleans.
yeah, love it.
But you have to drive over to Jefferson Parish.
Oh, I'm
All
very
those
familiar.
I think that fireworks are not legal here, but yeah, it is definitely a do-it-yourself thing. Although there's also
Mhm,
beautiful fireworks over the skyline. You
mhm.
go down to like the Riverside Park
Oh
there,
yeah,
Waldenburg Park,
great spot.
and that's it's and they launch them from the river. It's amazing.
Mhm,
But definitely, like when I think about fireworks as a kid, they weren't legal in Western Pennsylvania where I grew up,
mhm.
but that didn't stop. I know for some people, July 4th means illegal fireworks and
Yeah,
just danger and the
yeah.
element of danger,
Mhm,
right? On a couple of levels, right? Because I think that like the roadside stands, what's fun with that, what we'll do here on our block out in the street
mhm,
tomorrow with all the neighborhood kids is like the gallery.
mhm.
Is some of the stuff is like, well, let's see what this does. Let's see what happens when we light this
Yes.
fuse, which is fun. The mystery.
Mhm,
But I remember as a kid, and the kind of illegal fireworks are around when I was a kid that like my stepdad and people were getting, these were like equivalent to a quarter stick of dynamite, kind of
yeah.
like they're really like blowing stuff up. Like seeing what happens when you blow stuff up. I remember my stepdad, may he rest in peace. He was so bold. I think one year we went to the high school baseball field. We're going to go to the high school baseball field to take our legal fireworks and have our own 4th of July, which, speaking of America and free, Western Pennsylvania was where the first rebellion against the federal government happened, the Whiskey Rebellion. So where I grew up was the first place that like newly minted Americans were like, no, we're not having this. Isn't that American in and of itself? And certainly that was one of the memories I have for the 4th of July. What about summer, man? I mean, because this is it. Like 4th of July is like the middle of summer. We're at peak summertime now. What does summertime mean to you? Oh, you're on mute. We're back.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, all right, good. Just want to make sure. Yeah, I was having some audio issues there. So you're talking about what summer means to me, right? When I think about the summer, obviously time at the beach, time at the pool. I grew up near the coast, so that was always kind of part of my DNA. But just kind of really just like relaxing. Plus, it's a time too if you have kids to kind of catch up on some things that you weren't able to catch up on during the year, whether it's certain movies or TV shows or just
Mhm.
time outside. So when I think of the summer, it's obviously a busy time for us as we approach like August, but I think it's important to kind of carve out those times just for family, vacations, trips, and just it's the quiet moments that really stick with me in my memory, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Well, no, totally. I mean, the older I get, Eric, the more what I wish for when I blow out the birthday candle is peace, just peace.
Mhm.
I value peace very highly, more than I did when I was younger. Maybe I was like, wanting to make things happen, getting into stuff. But you mentioned sharing movies and TVs with your kid, movie TV shows, because it's like a cliche. It's always a cliche, but it's a cliche because it happens so often and it's true. You
Mhm.
know, um, where I totally find myself like I think I feel like it's one of the biggest personal victories when I can show my stepson a movie. I think I remember Cloak and Dagger. People don't remember Cloak and Dagger. Dabney Coleman. It's like a
Oh, I
kid.
remember.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, here's a movie from my childhood that I think you'll like.
Mhm.
What's something that was like a priority for you, TV or movie wise, to share with your kids?
You know what's funny? You mentioned that I'm smiling because we ended up doing okay, I'll give you one. I got so many six I can go down. I'll give you one. So the movie going experience that I remember the most growing up, I was probably too young to go to the movies to go see this. I'll just be candid, but my dad took me anyway, and
Sure.
that was Batman 1989, Keaton,
Oh yeah.
Nicholson, and I remember going to the theater. The theater doesn't exist anymore. Going to see that movie, and so I know we had the Flash movie come out like last summer, right, where Keaton was in it. So I was excited because Keaton was my favorite Batman, and I remember my son. I'm like, hey, we're gonna go see this, right? Just to go see Keaton. You got to go see Keaton. And so we ended up watching like he hadn't seen them at this point. He wasn't really old enough until now. So we watched Batman '89. We watched Batman Returns,
Hmm.
like in anticipation of going to see the Flash. But we also watched the other DC movies that were kind of part of that universe at the time. And so that was really like a cool moment. We also watched like the Spider-Man movies from the early 2000s, Tobey Maguire,
Hmm.
and then we watched all those to lead up to Spider-Man No Way Home. So it's like little stuff like that that's really like fun because it's like movies like in the 80s, in the 90s that I love growing up, and it's nice to see like your kids like resonate with those movies too, saying, "Hey, that was pretty good. I like that." So I'm totally on board with what you're
Yeah.
saying there. I was
Yeah,
feeling.
I mean, it's one of the joys of parenting, really.
Mm-hmm,
But you mentioned I also saw that Batman movie in the theater with my pop, may he rest in peace.
mm-hmm,
And I think what people don't understand now that we're in past the height of comic book movies dominating the box office. I could go on a
mm-hmm,
rant about the 08, 09 financial crisis and how that made
mm-hmm.
movies turn to like safe, bankable
Yeah.
bets instead of creative things. But when
Mm-hmm,
we were younger, the comic book hero movies were creative. Like they were
yeah.
distinct. And I mean, the Superman movies have a completely different aesthetic and style and pacing than the Batman movies. And when you
Mm-hmm,
went to see the Michael Keaton, Jack Nicholson Batman, nobody had any idea what,
mm-hmm,
like everybody was kind of blindsided by it because it was audacious. It was campy. Jack Nicholson. It was one of the best.
mm-hmm,
Jack Nicholson's, a Mount Rushmore actor, and even though
mm-hmm,
you don't think of it as a thespian, classic
mm-hmm.
acting, what he brought to the Joker. I know everyone, Heath Ledger, he rest in peace.
Yeah.
People think about the Joker in terms of the recent incarnations, but Jack Nicholson,
Mm-hmm,
I mean, he occupied the screen. I mean, he took the movie away from Michael Keaton. That's not to say anything bad about Michael Keaton's
Oh, no,
performance,
it's true. Yeah.
but nobody knew what to expect going into that. So it was extremely impactful. Now, have you seen Birdman, the Michael Keaton movie
Mhm.
Birdman?
Oh yeah, yeah. I have seen that. Yeah.
That's cool because it's like a
Mm-hmm,
parenthetical
mm-hmm,
comment, of like almost autobiographical, kinda. I love that movies with the movies story, like
mm-hmm.
references to the real world through a fantastical world and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But we go back to our fantastical world of fantasy football together.
Mm-hmm,
Take a couple weeks off, be at the beach, be back with a preseason watch list. You all know you can follow Eric and Moody. You see him on ESPN. And again, through July 7th, you get 10% off your first order of any Football Guys premium subscription. Thanks everyone for supporting what we do here. We love serving you. You're the best because you're so classy.